Imagine standing in darkness on a brass line, 1 foot in the eastern hemisphere, 1 foot in the west. This is Greenwich. This is where the world agreed to begin counting. This is not a geography lesson. This is a story about a line in the dark. A line you can stand on, 1 foot in the eastern hemisphere, 1 foot in the west. A line that doesn't exist except in brass and agreement. Tonight, we're walking through Greenwich after the gates have closed, after the tourists have left, when the only sound is the Thames flowing past below the hill. This is where the world agreed to begin counting. 0 degrees longitude, the Prime Meridian, Greenwich Mean Time. But these are just names for something deeper, a quiet agreement among people who had never met, speaking languages they didn't share, to synchronize their clocks and their maps around one reference point. You don't need to stay awake for this entire story. In fact, falling asleep early would be perfect. This is bedtime content for adults who want something smarter than white noise but calmer than a podcast. Interesting enough to hook you, boring enough to let you go. Find a comfortable position. Screen face down if you like. Volume low. We're going to Greenwich, but in our own time at our own pace. Let's begin. It's late evening in Greenwich, South London. The sun has set. The shops along the riverfront have closed. The market stalls are quiet. A few lights glow from riverside pubs, but most of the neighborhood has settled into night. From the river, you can hear water lapping against the old stone pier. Somewhere across the Thames, a ship's bell rings twice. Greenwich has always been a place defined by the river and by time. You're walking now away from the river, through the narrow streets toward Greenwich Park. The air is cool. Not cold, just the kind of evening that makes you walk with your hands in your pockets. Ahead, the park gates are closed, but a smaller pedestrian entrance is open. You slip through. Inside the park, the city noise fades. There's grass underfoot, paths winding upward toward the hill. Trees stand dark against the sky. At the top of the hill, silhouetted against faint light from distant street lamps, sits a building. Flamsteed House, the Royal Observatory, the home of Greenwich Mean Time. You begin to climb the path. It's not a steep climb, but it's noticeable. With each step, the river below becomes more distant. The path curves gently. There are benches along the way, empty now. As you get closer, you can make out details. The dome of the observatory, the brickwork of Flamsteed House, the courtyard where the meridian line is marked. The building itself is dark. No visitors. No lights in the windows. But in the courtyard, faintly visible, is a thin brass line set into the paving stones. This line runs north to south. It divides the courtyard. It divides the earth. You walk toward it slowly. When you reach it, you stop. 1 foot on either side, east and west. The brass feels cool even through your shoe. This is 0 degrees longitude, the Prime Meridian. From this spot, every measurement east or west around the globe begins. London, Paris, Tokyo, San Francisco. Every city's position is measured from here. Not because this spot is special in any natural way, but because in 1884, people from 25 nations agreed it should be. For you tonight, this line is just a place to rest your attention. A starting point for a long, slow story about how the world synchronized itself. The building behind you has stood on this hill since 1675. King Charles II commissioned it. Sir Christopher Wren designed it. It was built for one purpose: to solve the problem of finding a ship's position at sea. The observatory was placed here on this hill because the location was high enough to see the horizon clearly. Astronomers needed to observe the stars as they crossed the sky, tracking their positions with precision. From those observations, they could create tables, charts showing where certain stars would be at certain times. Sailors, far out at sea, could use those tables to figure out where they were. But the system only worked if the tables were accurate. And accuracy required instruments, telescopes, clocks, careful record keeping. The first astronomer royal was John Flamsteed. He spent 40 years here, making over 50,000 observations of the moon and stars. Flamsteed House, the original building, still stands. It has an octagonal room at the top, designed specifically for telescopes. The walls are brick. The windows are tall and narrow. The floors creak. At night, in Flamsteed's time, the only light inside would have been from candles or oil lamps. Just enough light to see the instruments, to write down observations in careful script. Flamsteed would have worked late, watching the sky, waiting for a specific star to cross the meridian, the imaginary line running from north to south directly overhead. When the star crossed that line, he noted the exact time. Over years, these observations built up. Patterns emerged. Tables were created. Those tables, published in the Nautical Almanac, became essential tools for sailors. But here's the thing. Every country had its own meridian. France measured from Paris. Spain from Cadiz. Some maps used the Canary Islands. Sailors using a British chart would see one set of numbers. Sailors using a French chart would see different numbers for the same location. It worked, but it was inefficient, confusing, dangerous. By the 1880s, the world was more connected than ever before. Ships crossed oceans regularly. Telegraphs sent messages across continents in seconds. Railways linked cities. And yet, there was no global agreement on where 0 degrees longitude should be. Something had to change. Let's step back for a moment. To understand why the meridian mattered, you need to understand what came before. For centuries, finding your position at sea was part science, part guesswork. Latitude, your position north or south, was relatively easy. You could measure the angle of the sun at noon, or the angle of certain stars at night. Those measurements told you how far you were from the equator. But longitude, your position east or west, was a different problem entirely. There's no natural reference point for longitude, no equivalent to the equator. The solution requires time. Here's how it works. The Earth rotates once every 24 hours. That means it turns 360 degrees in 24 hours, or 15 degrees per hour. If you know the time at a reference location, say Greenwich, and you also know the local time where you are, you can calculate how far east or west you've traveled. For example, if it's noon where you are, the sun is at its highest point, but your clock says it's 3 p.m. in Greenwich, then you're 3 hours behind Greenwich time. 3 hours equals 45 degrees west. The math is simple, but the execution was nearly impossible. To make this work, you need a clock that keeps perfect time, even on a rolling ship in changing temperatures with salt spray and humidity. In the 1700s, no such clock existed. Ships got lost regularly. In 1707, a British naval fleet misjudged its position near the Scilly Isles. 4 ships were wrecked. Over 1,400 sailors died. The disaster was caused by a simple navigation error. They thought they were farther west than they actually were. Parliament responded in 1714 by offering a prize, £20,000, equivalent to several million pounds today, to anyone who could solve the problem of finding longitude at sea. The prize was administered by the Board of Longitude, a group of scientists, astronomers, and naval experts. Many tried. Most failed. Astronomers proposed using the moon's position to calculate time. It worked, but it required complex calculations that took hours. What was needed was something simpler. A reliable clock. Enter John Harrison. Harrison was a carpenter from Yorkshire, self-taught. No formal training in clockmaking. But he understood pendulums, springs, balance, friction. In 1735, he completed his first marine timekeeper, called H1. Was massive, 75 pounds. Required a case 4 feet square. But it worked. On a trial voyage, it kept time well enough to prove the concept. Harrison wasn't satisfied. He spent decades refining his designs. H2, H3. Each one smaller, more precise, more reliable. Finally, in 1759, he completed H4. H4 was different. It looked like a large pocket watch, 5 inches in diameter, weighed just over 3 pounds. Inside, it had a fast-beating balance wheel controlled by a temperature-compensated spiral spring. In 1761, Harrison's son William carried H4 on a sea trial to Jamaica. The voyage took 81 days. H4 lost only 5 seconds. 5 seconds over 81 days. That translates to an error of about 1 nautical mile. The Longitude Act required accuracy within 30 nautical miles. Harrison had beaten the requirement by a factor of 30. But the Board of Longitude was reluctant to award the prize. They demanded another trial, more tests. They wanted Harrison to reveal how the watch worked. It took years. Eventually, with the intervention of King George III, Parliament granted Harrison £8,750 in 1773 when he was 80 years old. He never received the official prize, but he was compensated for his work. In total, he received about £23,000, close to the original prize amount. Harrison died 3 years later. But his clocks, H1, H2, H3, H4, changed navigation forever. By the early 1800s, marine chronometers based on Harrison's designs were standard equipment on ships. Captain James Cook carried a copy of H4, called K1, on his second voyage. He called it his faithful guide through all vicissitudes of climates. With accurate clocks, sailors could finally determine longitude. But that created a new question. Longitude from where? Back at Greenwich, astronomers continued their work. In 1850, the seventh astronomer Royal George Biddell Airy designed a new instrument, the Airy Transit Circle. It was a large telescope, mounted so it could only move along the meridian, the north-south line directly overhead. As stars crossed that line, their positions were recorded with extreme precision. From January 1851 onward, this telescope defined the Greenwich Meridian. Over the next century, it would make more than 600,000 observations. Picture the instrument now in the dark. It's housed in a small observatory building, separate from Flamsteed House. The telescope itself is brass and iron, beautifully machined, balanced on precision bearings. At night, an astronomer would align it carefully, waiting for a specific star to appear in the eyepiece. When the star crossed the meridian, a clock would record the exact time. From those observations, astronomers could calculate the exact position of the meridian to within a fraction of an arcsecond. But the meridian wasn't just for astronomy. Ships needed to know what time it was in Greenwich so they could set their chronometers. In 1833, a time ball was installed on the roof of Flamsteed House. Every day at exactly 1 p.m., the ball would drop. Ships on the Thames could see it. Captains would check their chronometers against the drop. If the chronometer was off by even a few seconds, they would adjust it before sailing. The time ball is still there today. It still drops at 1 p.m. Imagine standing in the courtyard at night, looking up at the mast where the ball waits. It's just a sphere on a pole, but it represents something larger. The idea that time can be standardized, shared, synchronized. Greenwich time wasn't just for ships. In 1852, a clock was installed outside the observatory gates. It was called the Shepherd Gate Clock. It had a 24-hour dial instead of the usual 12. It displayed Greenwich Mean Time directly to the public. The clock is still there. You can see it if you visit during the day. At night, it's just a dark circle on the wall. But it's still ticking. In the courtyard of the Royal Observatory, there's a line. It's thin, maybe an inch wide, made of brass set into stone. It runs perfectly straight from one end of the courtyard to the other. At night, under faint light, it glows softly. This line marks the Prime Meridian. 0 degrees, 0 minutes, 0 seconds longitude. Every measurement of east or west on Earth begins here. It's an arbitrary choice. There's nothing geologically special about this spot. No magnetic pole. No natural feature that demands this is 0. It's 0 because people agreed it should be 0. That's what makes it remarkable. Tourists love to stand on it. 1 foot in the eastern hemisphere, 1 foot in the west. It's a photo opportunity, a novelty. But at night, when the courtyard is empty, the line feels different. It's quieter, more serious. This line divides the world. Everything east of here, Paris, Moscow, Beijing, Tokyo, is measured as degrees east. Everything west, New York, Los Angeles, Rio, Buenos Aires, is measured as degrees west. The line doesn't stop at Greenwich. It runs north through London, crosses the Thames, continues through England and into the North Sea. It crosses through France, Spain, Algeria, Mali, Burkina Faso, Togo, Ghana. It passes through the South Atlantic, crosses Antarctica, and continues to the South Pole. From pole to pole, an imaginary line connecting places that have nothing in common except this. They happen to lie on 0 degrees longitude. At 180 degrees, the opposite side of the world, the line becomes the international date line. That's where today becomes yesterday, where the calendar changes. All because of this brass line in a courtyard in South London. It's strange when you think about it. We've built our entire global system of navigation, time zones, and geography around an arbitrary reference point chosen by a committee in 1884. And yet it works. Not because the line is real, but because we all agree to use it. In October 1884, representatives from 25 nations gathered in Washington, D.C. They met in the diplomatic hall of the U.S. Department of State. The purpose: to agree on a single prime meridian for the entire world. At the time, different countries used different prime meridians. British charts used Greenwich. French charts used Paris. Spanish charts sometimes used Cadiz. Some maps used the Canary Islands. It worked for domestic purposes, but international trade, shipping, and communication were becoming chaotic. A ship leaving New York with a British chart would use one set of coordinates. The same ship arriving in Paris would find French charts with completely different numbers for the same location. The world needed a standard. President Chester A. Arthur invited nations to send delegates. In total, 41 delegates attended, representing countries from Europe, North America, South America, and Asia. The only Asian nation present was Japan. The debates lasted 3 weeks. France argued for a neutral meridian, one that didn't pass through any major nation's capital. Some suggested using the meridian 180 degrees opposite Greenwich, which runs mostly through the Pacific Ocean. But the practical argument won the day. By the 1880s, over 2/3 of the world's ships already used charts based on the Greenwich meridian. Changing to a different meridian would have required reprinting thousands of charts, retraining navigators, and recalibrating instruments. It was simply more efficient to adopt what most of the world was already using. On October 13, 1884, the resolution was put to a vote. The question, should the meridian passing through the Airy Transit Circle at the Royal Observatory Greenwich be adopted as the Prime Meridian? 22 nations voted yes. One nation voted no, San Domingo, now the Dominican Republic. No one is entirely sure why. 2 nations abstained, France and Brazil. France's objection was understandable. Paris had been the center of French cartography for centuries. Accepting Greenwich felt like a national concession. France continued to use the Paris meridian on its maps until 1911. But the resolution passed. Greenwich became the official prime meridian of the world. The conference also recommended a global time zone system based on Greenwich Mean Time. They suggested dividing the world into 24 time zones, each 1 hour apart. The recommendation wasn't binding. Each country had to decide for itself whether to adopt the new system. Japan adopted Greenwich Mean Time in 1886. Other countries followed slowly. Portugal adopted it in 1913. France finally in 1914. It took decades, but eventually the world synchronized. Today, every GPS device, every smartphone, every map in the world uses a coordinate system based on the Greenwich Meridian. Not the original brass line in the courtyard. Technology has since refined the exact position by about 102 meters. But the concept remains. 0 degrees longitude, the place where east and west meet. All because delegates from 25 nations speaking different languages with different interests agreed on one thing: It was better to have a shared reference point than to keep arguing about which one to use. Before Greenwich Mean Time became a global standard, it had to become a national standard in Britain. And that change was driven not by astronomers or scientists, but by railways. In the early 1800s, every town in Britain kept its own local time. Time was set by the sun. When the sun reached its highest point, local noon, that's when clocks were set to 12 o'clock. This worked fine when travel was slow. But it created a problem. Towns to the east saw sunrise earlier than towns to the west. Bristol, in the west of England, was about 10 minutes behind London. Penzance, in the far southwest, was 20 minutes behind. As long as people stayed in their own towns, this didn't matter. But when railways began connecting cities in the 1830s and 1840s, the lack of a standard time became chaotic. Imagine you're in Bristol, waiting for a train to London. The timetable says the train departs at 3 p.m. But 3 p.m. by whose clock? Is that Bristol time or London time? If it's London time, the train leaves at 2:50 by your local clock. If you arrive at 3 o'clock Bristol time, you've already missed it. Multiply this confusion across hundreds of towns and you can see the problem. In 1840, the Great Western Railway decided to adopt a single time standard for all its stations: London time. Other railway companies followed. By 1847, most railway companies in Britain were using railway time, which was Greenwich Mean Time. But it was still voluntary. Many towns kept their own local time for non-railway purposes. It wasn't until 1880 that the British Parliament passed the Statutes, Definition of Time, Act, which made Greenwich Mean Time the legal standard for the entire country. From that point on, every clock in Britain was synchronized to Greenwich. The change was driven by practicality. As the world became more connected, by rail, by telegraph, by steamship, the need for synchronized time became urgent. You couldn't run an efficient railway network with every town on its own time. You couldn't coordinate telegraph messages between cities if their clocks didn't match. And you couldn't navigate a ship safely if you didn't know precisely what time it was in Greenwich. The solution was standardization. Not because one time was inherently better than another, but because having everyone on the same system eliminated confusion. This is the same logic that led to the Prime Meridian. It didn't matter whether zero longitude was at Greenwich, Paris, or the Canary Islands. What mattered was that everyone agreed on the same zero. Once that agreement was in place, everything else became easier. In 1851, the first submarine telegraph cable was laid across the English Channel. Messages that once took days to deliver by ship could now be sent in seconds. By the 1860s, telegraph cables connected Britain to India. By the 1870s, cables crossed the Atlantic. The telegraph transformed communication, but it also created a new need: synchronized time. If you're sending a message from London to Bombay, both cities need to agree on what time the message was sent. Without synchronized clocks, coordination across time zones becomes impossible. The solution was to transmit time signals via telegraph. Every day at a specific time, a signal would be sent from Greenwich along telegraph lines to cities across Britain and eventually across the world. Telegraph operators would use these signals to set their clocks. By the 1920s, time signals were being broadcast via radio. In 1924, the BBC began broadcasting the Greenwich time signal, known as the 6 pips. The pips are 6 short beeps, 5 at 1-second intervals, followed by a longer beep precisely at the top of the hour. Millions of people across Britain would synchronize their clocks by listening to the pips. The system is still used today. If you listen to BBC radio, you can still hear the Greenwich pips at the top of certain hours. It's a small sound, 6 beeps. But it represents something profound: the ability to coordinate time across vast distances. Before telegraphs and radio, time was local. Now time is global. A ship in the middle of the Pacific can receive a time signal and know, within a fraction of a second, what time it is in Greenwich. That signal allows the ship to calculate its longitude accurately. In the age of GPS and atomic clocks, this might seem quaint. But in the early 20th century, it was revolutionary. Time, once tied to the sun and the stars, had become something that could be transmitted, shared, and standardized. And the reference point for that time was Greenwich. Not because Greenwich was the center of the world, but because the world had agreed to use it as a reference. Picture a ship at night, somewhere in the North Atlantic. The year is 1920. The ship is a merchant vessel carrying cargo from Liverpool to New York. The captain stands on the bridge, looking out at dark water. There are no lights except the ship's own running lights and the stars overhead. Somewhere below deck in the chart room there's a box. Inside the box, mounted on gimbals so it stays level even as the ship rolls, is a marine chronometer. It ticks steadily, 5 times per second. The chronometer is set to Greenwich Mean Time. The captain has never been to Greenwich. He's never seen the observatory. But every day he trusts that chronometer to tell him where he is. At noon, when the sun reaches its highest point, the captain takes a reading with a sextant. He measures the angle of the sun above the horizon. From that, he calculates his latitude. Then he checks the chronometer. If the chronometer reads 3 p.m. when the sun is at its highest, that means the ship is 3 hours behind Greenwich time. 3 hours equals 45 degrees west of Greenwich. With latitude from the sextant and longitude from the chronometer, the captain marks his position on the chart. He draws a small pencil cross. That cross represents lives, cargo, safe passage. If the chronometer is wrong by even a few minutes, the cross could be dozens of miles off. That error could mean running into rocks, missing a port, burning extra fuel. So the captain treats the chronometer with care. It lives in its box. It's wound at the same time every day. Its accuracy is checked against radio time signals when possible. The chronometer is a physical connection to Greenwich, even when the ship is thousands of miles away. For the captain, Greenwich isn't just a place. It's a concept. It's the idea that somewhere far away there's a reference point, a zero, a place where time is defined. And as long as his chronometer agrees with that reference point, he can navigate safely. This is the quiet trust that made global navigation possible. Not just trust in technology, but trust in a shared system. The understanding that ships all over the world were using the same reference point, the same zero, the same time standard. And that shared understanding kept them safe. Take a moment now to come back to your own body. You've been listening to a story about reference points, about lines on maps, about clocks and time. But your body has its own reference points. There's a center line running through you from the top of your head to the base of your spine. This is your personal meridian. Notice where your body makes contact with whatever surface you're lying on. Feel the weight of your heels, your calves, the backs of your thighs. your hips, your lower back, your shoulder blades, the back of your head. These are your reference points, the places where you are grounded. You don't need to be anywhere else. Just like the brass line at Greenwich doesn't need to justify its position, you don't need to justify yours. You are 0 degrees in your own system. The place where your measurements begin. Let your jaw unclench if it's tight. Let your tongue rest against the floor of your mouth. Your shoulders can drop, just a little, just enough. Imagine your breath like the ticking of a clock. In for 3 seconds. Out for 4 seconds. You don't have to control it. Just notice it. Your heart beats in your chest, steady and automatic. It's been keeping time since before you were born. It will keep time tonight while you sleep. You don't have to manage it. You don't have to think about it. Your body knows how to rest. Think of the ships that trusted their chronometers. They didn't need to understand every gear and spring inside. They just needed to trust that the mechanism worked. You can trust your body the same way. It knows how to breathe. It knows how to heal. It knows how to sleep. You are allowed to stop performing. You are allowed to stop calculating your position. You are allowed to simply be here in this moment at rest. The world will keep turning. The Meridian line at Greenwich will still be there tomorrow. The ships will still navigate. The clocks will still tick. You don't have to hold any of it together tonight. Let your fingers uncurl. Let your arms be heavy. Let your legs sink into the surface beneath you. You are held. You are supported. And you are exactly where you need to be. Back at Greenwich, the observatory still stands on the hill. The tourists have left. The gates are closed. The brass line in the courtyard glows faintly under ambient light from the city. At night, a green laser beam shoots north from the observatory, marking the Meridian line across the London sky. On clear nights, the beam can be seen from over 20 kilometers away. It's a modern addition installed in 1999. But it serves the same purpose as the brass line. to mark the invisible, to make visible something that exists only by agreement. The actual work of defining global coordinates has moved on. Today, the official Prime Meridian is the IERS reference meridian, defined not by a brass line but by satellite data. It runs about 102 meters east of the historic meridian at Greenwich. If you stand on the brass line and check your phone's GPS, it won't read exactly 0 degrees longitude. But the concept persists. Greenwich is still the reference point in our minds, on our maps, in our time zones. The observatory itself is now a museum. You can visit during the day and see Harrison's chronometers, H1, H2, H3, H4, displayed in glass cases. You can stand on the meridian line and take a photo. You can look through the Airy Transit Circle telescope. But at night, when the building is closed, it returns to what it's always been, a quiet place on a hill where people once looked at the stars and tried to make sense of the world. The work continues in a way. Astronomers at Greenwich still study the sky, though they now use modern equipment. The Shepherd Gate clock still ticks on the wall outside. The time ball still drops at 1 p.m. every day. These are rituals now more than necessities. But they remind us that time, like longitude, is something we create together. It's not a natural feature of the world. It's a shared agreement, a collective decision to say, this is 0. This is where we begin counting. And somehow that agreement has held for over a century. It's held through wars, through technological revolutions, through political upheavals. The brass line in the courtyard remains. Not because it's powerful, but because it's useful. You've walked with me tonight through Greenwich, through history, through brass lines and clock towers and ships at sea. We've talked about meridians, time zones, conferences, chronometers. But at the heart of it all is something simpler. People, separated by oceans and languages and centuries, agreeing on a shared reference point. Agreeing that it was better to have a common 0 than to each insist on their own. That kind of agreement requires humility. It requires letting go of the need to be at the center. It requires accepting that the reference point is arbitrary, but the coordination is essential. You can apply that same logic to yourself tonight. You don't have to be at the center of everything. You don't have to justify your position. You can simply be here at rest and let the world turn without you for a while. The meridian will still be there in the morning. The clocks will still tick. The ships will still navigate. And you will wake up, rested, ready to begin again. For now, let yourself drift. Let your thoughts slow. Let the story fade into the background. You've done enough today. You can sleep now. Good night.